I think one common goal that should be at least considered for this conflict is the prevention of a major escalation. Because whether you're talking about the use of nuclear weapons, for example, or even a major energy cutoff, this is going to hurt everybody involved, right? So this is going to have negative impacts for all sides. So to me, that would be a good enough reason to have some diplomacy, if not to end the conflict, then at least to prevent these kind of major escalations from happening.
Hello, everybody. I'm Pascal, and this is another video about diplomacy in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. I'm joined today by Eugene Chausovsky, who is a senior analyst and program head of the US think tank, New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. He previously served as a senior Eurasia analyst at the geopolitical intelligence firm Stratfor, and he is a lecturer in geopolitics of Central Asia at the US Department of State's Foreign Service Institute. His work focuses on political, economic, and security issues pertaining to Russia, Eurasia, and China. Mr. Chausovsky recently published a hopeful article for the US magazine Foreign Policy entitled "Diplomacy is still just about possible in Ukraine," in which he argues that the Black Sea Grain Initiative could function as a kernel for a diplomatic solution of the war. Mr. Chausovsky, Eugene, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Eugene, let me maybe start by asking you about your personal background. Where are you from? What kind of work do you do at these US think tanks? And what school of thought or what philosophies guide you for your strategic assessments?
Sure. So I'm from Ukraine originally. Still back in the Soviet period is when I was born, actually in Moscow, but my entire family is from Kiev. It was just because of Chernobyl that I was born in Moscow. So an interesting bit of history tied into personal background. But I grew up in the US, and my background from an analytical perspective is largely tied to geopolitics, although far from exclusively that school of thought. And so I'm very interested in kind of the intersection of geopolitics with the current developments that we see in the international sphere, but also the importance of human agency. So how the impersonal forces and personal forces shape state decision making. And so I think the Ukraine conflict that's currently underway is a very unique and interesting case study of that really a lot of these elements are come into play.
So how do you interpret the conflict that's going on at the moment? How do you frame it? What's going on? What are we witnessing?
So I think having followed the conflict not just from this year, but going back to 2014, the Euromaidan uprising, in which I was actually in Kiev when it happened. It's really an interesting case study of the clash of geopolitical imperatives, if you will, because Russia has these sort of traditional interests in Ukraine, obviously in the broader former Soviet Union, to try to keep these countries into its fold. But then you have these countries charting their own path, whether that's Ukraine or the Baltic states or really any of the states. But you also have a great power competition element as well with the US and the EU and NATO as well, trying to bring these countries out of the Russian orbit, support their independence. So there's a number of these different factors in play, and we've seen really the kind of these interests clash and exacerbate over the course of the past 10 years, and obviously over the course of the past year, where Russia under Putin basically decided to take matters into its own hands and achieve its objectives by military force after diplomatic and other forms of politics, economics, and security pressure did not meet what Putin considered to be Russia's objectives.
Some people I've had on this podcast, including top-level former US ambassadors, like most importantly, Ambassador Jack Matlock, have argued that this tragedy was a long time in the making, and it has a lot to do with pushing Russia into a corner. Now, this narrative is very much disputed on the other side, saying that this is Russian disinformation and propaganda. Nobody pushed Russia anywhere. You who has been in Ukraine then in 2014, when a lot of things that were already rolling just started rolling faster. Where do you, how do you interpret that?
Well, I think that's certainly one way of looking at it. As a strategic analyst, as a geopolitical analyst, I do try to look at these kinds of situations from the perspectives of all of the parties involved. So trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody like Putin, but at the same time Zelensky and Western leaders. So certainly I can understand, at least philosophically, that can be the interpretation that the West was trying to put Russia into a corner, essentially, from the Kremlin's point of view. But I can also understand from Ukraine's point of view wanting self-determination, and from the Western point of view, there is the support of that in terms of supporting a democratic Ukraine, but also there are its own power interests in mind as well. So the truth is usually somewhere in between all of these. But what we see there is, as I said, a clash of imperatives, a clash of interests, and it's playing out, unfortunately, largely at the expense of Ukrainian lives, essentially.
Yes, and I mean Ukrainian and Russian soldiers who are asked to kill each other. Do you still believe that overall what is happening at the moment still follows a rational playbook on both sides? Because sometimes we hear Vladimir Putin is just a Hitler, he's irrational, and he wouldn't lend himself anymore to diplomacy. Your article argues no, diplomacy is still very much possible. Can you maybe explain why you would say that at the moment, well, probably like we still have rational actors?
Right. I mean, I do think that a lot of the behavior has, it is understandable from a rational point of view, although that can be taken to its limits. For example, Russia wanting to keep Ukraine in its fold and out of NATO is something that I can understand from a rational perspective. But the measures to do so, that's where you kind of get into a more tricky territory, because, I mean, I could make the argument that even the threat of taking military action on Russia's part, which it basically had for the last 8 years leading up to February, was more effective than actually carrying out this military action. Now we're seeing all of the constraints and the ripple effects of what it means to actually go into the country in a full-scale way, that the Western support is probably bigger or more effective than what Russia had expected, what Putin had expected. So it really, when it comes down to the decision making, that's when it gets a little bit more difficult to predict and rationalize. But the broader strategy, the broader imperatives, what they're trying to accomplish, it does make a certain degree of sense. Then you just kind of have to fight it out either on the ground or diplomatically. And that's kind of what I've been arguing, is that there is a sort of diplomacy that's happening even despite all of the military actions that we've seen. You mentioned the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I've really picked up on this because I think it was really interesting. It's really the only major agreement that's taken place since the start of the war, and it includes both Russia and Ukraine, along with international mediation, that actually had a common goal that they were able to get around and implement, essentially, despite all of the challenges that we've seen. Now, looking at it from a broader perspective, there's a lot more challenges. With grain, it's pretty obvious that you want food exports to go out if you're Ukraine and Russia. The global community obviously needed it in terms of a food crisis. When you're talking about security and security guarantees, that is a lot more difficult. But I do think it offers some kind of a framework, at least, to consider it, moving forward.
So one of the problems we have at the moment is that this entire tragedy is unfolding just at this speed, a rapid speed, right? You published that article on the 24th of September, basically 10 days ago, less than 2 weeks. And in between that time, now Russia basically added these 4 new Ukrainian oblasts to its state territory, like escalating the level also of violence that the Russian constitution then allows or will allow now to take place. And on the other hand, somebody blew up the two Nord Stream pipelines. This is getting worse, and it's getting worse in a fast. Do you still see diplomacy as a tool to solve this, and what would it take, speaking as of today on October 4th, to get to some sort of diplomatic process?
Right. So I do think that diplomacy still can be a tool. And, as I mentioned before, diplomacy, it does not have to be mutually exclusive from military action. Most of the time they're paired together, right? So usually in these types of conflicts, it's when both sides, or at least one of the sides, are militarily exhausted that diplomacy really comes into play in terms of changing the nature of the conflict. And you could make the argument, and I think the recent developments point to the fact that that's not the case at this stage. Ukraine has made some gains in its counteroffensives. Russia is obviously mobilizing its troops and trying to change the situation on the ground politically. So they still appear to be thinking that these types of actions can improve their position. Now, my argument in the article is that, like the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had a very clear common purpose, which everybody could get around. And unlike previous efforts to resolve the conflict, such as the Minsk agreements, which were always subject to different interpretations, right? I think one common goal that should be at least considered for this conflict is the prevention of a major escalation, because whether you're talking about, the use of nuclear weapons, for example, or even a major energy cutoff, this is going to hurt everybody involved, right? So this is going to have negative impacts for all sides. So to me, that would be a good enough reason to have some diplomacy, if not to end the conflict, then at least to prevent these kind of major escalations from happening. Now, it doesn't seem like the sides are quite ready for that, but it's just a question of timing, because at some point they will come to the table. And I think it should be sooner rather than later. But of course, we see the situation playing out differently.
And the thing is, wars only end in one of two ways. Either one of the sides is completely subdued and has to surrender, or it's diplomatically negotiated. And let's be honest, even surrender is usually a diplomatic negotiation, at least to some degree. So I agree. I'm totally with you on the same line that at some point there needs to be discussions. It's just at this point in time, I wonder what would be a realistic way forward, because as I see it, the Ukraine would still have as long as there is weapons that go into Ukraine, and as long as there's more military support, there naturally the Kiev would keep on fighting. And as long as Russia can still mobilize more troops, etc., and can still up its own war effort, it would also continue. So at which point do you think the convergence of mutual interest would be strong enough to say no, we will stop, we will do what we did with the grain exports. We want to achieve a higher goal, a goal outside of warfare, and go to diplomacy?
That's a good question. I wish I had an answer. I think that at this stage, obviously, militarily, Ukraine is fighting to get its territories back. So that's a clear goal. And Zelensky himself has said that essentially negotiations for that are not possible, at least not with Putin, the current leadership. Now, I think the stage that we're in right now, I think the calculus from Russia's side is that that it's trying to basically inflict as much pain not only on Ukraine but also on the West. That's why we're seeing these hints of the nuclear weapons, but also the very real, as you mentioned, energy sabotage that we've seen in Nord Stream, some selective cutoffs. I think that Putin's calculation is that Western support for Ukraine is not static, meaning that it could still diminish to the point where the West can push Ukraine to the negotiating table. Now, the West is seeing that from the opposite side, that essentially the more pain that it can inflict on Russia in terms of sanctions and the security support for Ukraine, that Russia will be kind of backed into a corner. To me, the danger is that there's kind of this contest for who can tolerate more pain, right,
Yes.
between Russia and the West. I think historically, speaking, Russia has proven as a state, not just in under this government, but historically, that it has a higher threshold for pain tolerance than the West. And I think that's kind of what Putin is banking on. So it's a very dangerous contest to be in my opinion, and one that can still be resolved or at least mitigated diplomatically. But again, that doesn't seem to be the calculus of any of the leadership of the warring parties at this stage.
There was an interesting tweet today by Elon Musk. I don't know if you saw that, where he asked whether there should be a certain set of agreements made, among which he listed Crimea stays with Russia, the four oblasts, they get to do a real vote under UN auspices, like according to the books, and whatever the result is, Russia accepts it. And in return, Russia stops all of the warfare, and water supply and reconstruction starts. And of 1.9 million voters of like Mr. Musk's fellowship, only 38% said this is a good idea, and 62% said no, this is not a good idea. How do you view the involvement of, let's say, the general public in this very not only televised but social media vised conflict, and the impact it has on diplomatic possibilities?
So I think that poll is actually somewhat revealing of the current situation. I mean, as you said, 60% were against it. I mean, a lot of those proposals in a vacuum were quite, I would argue, practical, right? It settles a lot of the issues that are being discussed. Obviously the referendums that were held are not, legitimate, at least not from the Western standpoint. So that's not a basis from which to negotiate. So having a internationally mediated or international observers in a more legitimate referendum, things of that nature. Even Ukraine's neutrality, which at the beginning was floated out as a real possibility. But the problem is that this war has been going on for 8 years now. It's only accelerated, obviously, in the past year, and I think that makes it more and more difficult for such kind of seemingly practical measures to be really taken into consideration. Zelensky kind of outright rejected this notion, and I think the public, certainly of Ukraine and even of the West, I think is not in favor of these kinds of practical quote unquote measures at this stage, after how Russia has escalated the conflict. Essentially, Russia could make the argument that it's the West that's been escalating the conflict as well, but you have this polarization of positions, and it's really difficult. I mean, diplomacy and not only reaching an agreement but implementing it. That's why the Black Sea Grain Initiative, I think, is so notable, is that it's actually been implemented for more than 2 months successfully. It's one thing to reach an agreement, it's the other thing to carry it out. But that makes it really difficult in such a polarized political climate, unfortunately.
Of course, I mean, it's the very logic of war and these kind of large scale conflicts, that each side accuses the other one of being the evil one, right? And each side says like, no, I do what's necessary, what's important, and what's good. And then the question is, at which point do you get to sitting down and both sides giving something that they didn't want to give originally? But the one thing, this big question on my mind is, why did neutrality for Ukraine not materialize? To me, this would have been the most obvious thing in the world, because Ukraine in 2014 and even before that, and Austria in 1955 are such similar cases. Why is it that there was no win-win situation kind of emerging out of this contest in Eastern Europe?
So that's a great question. I mean, in my mind, this kind of boils down to the different perspectives of how, these parties view the conflict. Because yes, as you said, neutrality, this was something that was kind of floated from the beginning of this latest stage of the conflict. But along with neutrality, Ukraine would obviously sought security guarantees, in order to enforce that neutrality, because neutrality without security guarantees leaves it in a very vulnerable position. From Ukrainian standpoint, if they agree to it, what's to say that Russia won't, in a year's time or in a few years' time, try to change the situation on the ground once again? So they need the security guarantees from Western countries, from the US, from NATO countries. From Russia's perspective, it's also seeking security guarantees, which obviously, I mean, it can be laughable from the standpoint of Ukraine, because Ukraine never planned to attack Russia, right? But for Russia, the conflict is about much more than Ukraine, and it's about the entire security architecture of Europe. This is kind of what, Putin had floated in his, demands essentially leading up to the conflict, in December, exactly. That it's not just about Ukraine, but it's about NATO's expansion. And so Russia was seeking guarantees. So neither side was really prepared, essentially, to give those security guarantees, because everybody is trying to achieve their own security, but oftentimes in a practical way that has to come, or at least in reality, it has come at the expense of somebody else's security. So this is an issue that reflects the power dynamics, not only of Eastern Europe, but of the European security architecture as a whole. And what makes it really challenging, because to a large degree, it's based off of trust that doesn't exist.
The ridiculous irony of the entire thing is that, yes, Russia and Ukraine were both seeking more security and guarantees for their security, and ended up in a hot shooting war with each other, diminishing each other's security, right? So we have this classic tragedy of great power, or of power conflicts. So, as somebody who reads Ukrainian and Russian, do you have contacts with people in both countries who also think about diplomatic solutions? Is this something that, at least in the think tank world, maybe is going on, or what's your take on the intellectual level in both countries?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think, quite understandably from the Ukrainian side, there's not a lot of appetite right now for diplomacy. I mean, they're literally fighting for their lives and trying to get as much, Western support as possible in order to reclaim those territories. But, at the same time, they're very much aware that their, position is dependent on the West, right? And on the US in particular, in terms of continuing that support or increasing that support. So they, the Ukrainians would be amenable to some kind of arrangement if they felt the need from, in order to continue receiving that support and the broader security guarantees that we talked about from the West. From the Russian side, yes, I also do speak to people there. And, it's framed as, Russia is ready for peace, but now, it's a matter of what's negotiable. And even with these latest moves to annex, at least from the Russian side, these 4 Ukrainian territories, this to them is being, painted as off the table in terms of the negotiations, which just shows to you the difficulty of getting anywhere in this conflict. Because, I mean, this is, that's kind of the starting point from the Ukrainian Western side, is to, regain that territory, whereas Russia is trying to have peace, but really on its terms and in this new reality. So, that's why I still think that the main negotiations are still taking place on the battlefield, and it's if and when one or both sides become exhausted from this that we can actually start to see real movement. But unfortunately, there's not signs that that's happening anytime in the near future.
Maybe as a way to also wrap up, like in that case, on a smaller level, I think we all agree that this war still looks as if though it would be going on for quite some while. But do you see any other fields in which diplomacy could lead to other, like, smaller breakthroughs, in the sense of, in the same way that the Black Sea corn initiatives bore fruit, like humanitarian efforts, anything else that you can see maybe coming up in terms of like first steps?
Mhm. Right. Yeah, I do think that there is still, I mean, there have been signs with international mediation. Turkey has been involved quite a bit for arranging, tactical level agreements such as prisoner swaps, for example. We've seen that happen, from time to time. That I think is at least something, to show that there are those kinds of agreements are possible. And actually, in conversations that I had with the negotiators in Istanbul of the Black Sea grain initiative, speaking to both Turkey and also UN representatives, this was something that I brought up with them, is that can this grain initiative be applied to other goods, for example, because even Ukrainian officials had floated, using this humanitarian corridor to export metals, for example, that are now blocked as a result of the war. Um, Even some rumblings of an energy corridor of sorts to unlock those supplies. So I think that it would be, it's these kind of smaller tactical level agreements that I think are possible. And I think they could, the more those kinds of agreements happen and are successfully implemented, I think that does create a certain chance or a certain momentum to fold that into a broader agreement. I know, Turkey has expressed clear interest in, for its own purposes, but also for the security of the region, to leverage its mediation for the Black Sea Grain Initiative into a ceasefire agreement. That they've made very clear that that's their goal. Now, obviously, the latest developments point in the opposite direction. But there is work being done, not just by Turkey, but other mediators and international organizations like the UN. So as soon as that opening becomes available, I think we can start to see, there is some footing to jump off from, so to speak. So hopefully that happens sooner rather than later. But as you said, it's not looking great at the moment. But I think at some point we will get there, and hopefully that point is not too far away.
I share that hope with you. Thank you very much, Eugene, for talking to me today.
Thanks, my pleasure.